White cops tied a black man to a pole for fun, not knowing he was their new chief. A couple of the local officers figured they'd welcome me to their town in their own twisted way. They tied me to a streetlight in the middle of the main avenue, staging a show as if I were just another drifter passing through. Little did they know who they were actually dealing with or how badly this would turn around on them. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. Now let's go back to the beginning. The name's Charlie, age 50. I've been in law enforcement a long time, but recently I moved to this small, out-of-the-way town in Beverly Hills, USA, to take up the badge as the new chief of police. This wasn't my first rodeo. I've seen more than my fair share over the years. Yet this place had a certain keep-to-yourself vibe. Everyone seemed familiar with one another, and not too keen on outsiders. It wasn't long before I noticed the local cops seemed to be running their own version of the law, playing by a rule book I wasn't familiar with. The day before I officially started, I decided to explore the area, get a feel for the town, and scope out the locals. Dressed down in a worn cap and an old jacket, I tried to blend in. I wandered into a cozy-looking cafe that appeared older than me. The second I stepped in, I felt every set of eyes sizing me up, the classic "you don't belong here" vibe. Two officers were chuckling at a corner table, and from the quick glances they threw my way, it was obvious I'd become their latest source of amusement. Ignoring their stares, I ordered a coffee and tried to stay under the radar, watching to see how they'd respond. One of them, a lanky guy with a smirk, called over, "Hey, old man, you lost? You sure don't look like you're from around here?" I kept my expression neutral and answered, "Just passing through." They didn't look convinced. The tall one, Gary, with his smug grin, added, "Maybe keep moving along. Strangers don't last too long here." I shrugged it off and left, but I could feel their eyes trailing me. This was just the beginning, and something told me this new role wouldn't be all meetings and paperwork. The next morning, I decided to go for a run just outside of town. About halfway through, I heard a patrol car pull up beside me. Sure enough, it was the same pair from the cafe, Gary and his buddy Paul, a bulky guy who looked like he could knock out half a gym. "Hey, runner, lost again?" Gary called out as if I'd wandered onto their private turf. Paul chimed in, "You sure you're welcome here?" I kept my cool, slowed my pace, and replied, "Just out for a run. Thought that was still allowed." Gary sneered. "Allowed? Maybe. But strangers here don't exactly get the warmest welcome, especially if they don't know our rules." Before I could respond, they hopped out of the car. Gary walked up, way too close, and started patting my pockets without so much as asking. I took a breath and stayed calm while they rummaged through my pockets, exchanging smug glances. Finally, Gary pulled out a random scrap of plastic I'd had in my jacket and held it up like he'd just made some grand discovery. Well, look what we have here," he sneered as if it meant something. I could tell this was all part of some scheme, but I wasn't about to take the bait. They each grabbed one of my arms and started dragging me toward town without any explanation, as if I were a stray dog they'd found wandering the streets. They hauled me straight to the town square, tying my hands to a big lamppost in full view of the morning crowd. It was all theatrics. Gary and Paul cracked jokes. Putting on a show like this was some kind of performance for the locals. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gary announced with an exaggerated bow, "we've got ourselves a real troublemaker here." Paul joined in, adding, "Bet he's got a few tricks up his sleeve." People started gathering, some curious, others looking unfazed like this was an everyday spectacle. Phones came out, capturing the scene as Gary and Paul strutted around like they'd caught the town's most notorious criminal. Gary leaned in close and sneered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Can't have outsiders waltzing into our town causing trouble, can we?" As ridiculous as it was, the whole situation wasn't funny. It was disturbing. They were so absorbed in their own act, they didn't even notice how obvious it was to anyone paying attention that they'd set me up. I kept reminding myself to stay calm and let them keep digging their own graves. But this little scene didn't stay confined to Beverly Hills for long. By the next morning, clips of me tied to that lamppost had exploded online. Comment threads were overflowing with theories. Some thought I was a drifter who'd crossed a line, while others called out the cops, asking, "Who is this guy and why is he tied up in broad daylight?" Soon, local news got hold of the story. Journalists swarmed the square, mics in hand, pushing through the crowd for answers. They interviewed onlookers, some of whom just shrugged, saying, "Looks like the cops were having fun." Others were just as confused, questioning the absurdity of the whole spectacle. Meanwhile, Gary and Paul were still basking in their twisted moment, pacing around and cracking jokes as if they were center stage in some kind of comedy act. But what they didn't realize was that this whole scene had backfired. By then, the story had spread far beyond the town's borders, and people everywhere were starting to ask hard questions. The next few days would be filled with unexpected consequences that neither Gary nor Paul could have imagined as they tried to savor their small-town power trip. The fallout from Gary and Paul's performance was swift and brutal, and they were about to learn just how badly they'd miscalculated. By the following morning, the internet was ablaze with outrage. People across the country were demanding accountability, and Beverly Hills Police Headquarters was flooded with calls and emails demanding to know why two officers had publicly humiliated a stranger tied to a lamppost. The clip had gone viral on social media, and news anchors were calling it a shocking display of abuse and small-town corruption. As the media storm intensified, city officials in Beverly Hills were forced to respond. Mayor Ellis, an older, no-nonsense man with a reputation for keeping things orderly, was furious that his town's reputation was on the line. He called an emergency meeting with the police department, and within hours, Gary and Paul were summoned. They entered the mayor's office cocky, expecting to explain away their actions with their usual brand of charm and excuses. But they weren't prepared for what awaited them. Seated across from the mayor, Police Commissioner Halverson glared at them both with cold fury. "Gentlemen," he began, voice tight with barely restrained anger, "what in God's name were you thinking? Did you honestly believe that staging a public humiliation would go unnoticed?" Gary tried to shrug it off, flashing a casual grin. "Just having a little fun, Commissioner. Small-town joke, you know? Nobody got hurt." But Mayor Ellis was having none of it. He slammed his hand down on the desk, making both officers jump. "Fun? You think dragging a man through town, tying him up and humiliating him in front of the entire community is asterisk fun asterisk?" His voice dripped with disdain. For the first time, Paul looked worried. "It's not like that, sir. We were just trying to keep the town safe from outsiders stirring up trouble. We didn't know." "You didn't know that this man was Charlie Walters, the incoming chief of police?" The commissioner cut in, his tone ice cold. "Or did you think that just because you didn't know him, you could treat him any way you pleased?" Paul's face went pale as the realization hit him. The stranger they'd mocked, humiliated, and dragged to the lamppost in front of the entire town was their new boss. Their careers, their freedom, everything they'd taken for granted was crumbling before their eyes. Mayor Ellis turned to Commissioner Halverson. "I want them both removed from duty immediately," he said in a steely tone. "This behavior is unacceptable, and I won't have these men representing our town. As for any legal consequences, I leave that to you, Commissioner." By the end of the day, Gary and Paul had been officially dismissed from the police force. But the story didn't end there. Under the guidance of the Commissioner and Mayor Ellis, the district attorney launched a criminal investigation into the two former officers. They faced charges of abuse of power, assault, and unlawful detainment. The charges were serious, and as the trial began, more details of their unchecked behavior over the years surfaced. Witness after witness testified, revealing a disturbing pattern of bullying and misconduct. The court sentenced Gary and Paul to 5 years in prison for their abuse of authority and the harm they'd caused not just to Charlie, but to the town itself. It was a harsh punishment, but a necessary one, meant to send a message that abuse of power would not be tolerated. As for Charlie, he took over as police chief with determination. He committed to rebuilding trust between the police force and the community, implementing stricter policies to ensure transparency and accountability. Over time, the town warmed up to him, and people saw that he was nothing like the men who had come before. His reputation as a tough but fair officer quickly spread, and he made it his mission to ensure that no one else would ever have to endure the kind of abuse Gary and Paul had inflicted. In the end, Gary and Paul's attempt to welcome Charlie had turned into a public reckoning for them and a new beginning for the town. The people of Beverly Hills finally saw what could happen when those in power were held accountable, and they found a newfound respect for their chief, a man who had shown them the strength to stand up even when tied down. Leave a comment if you enjoyed this story. It doesn't cost you anything, and you'll make me very happy. Thank you, and I look forward to your like.